Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Premila Nattison. My pronouns are she, her. I am a professor of history and the co-director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, along with Janet Jacobson. So welcome to all of you to the annual Helen McIntyre Lecture, one of our signature lectures for the year. We are thrilled to have Professor Dána-Ain Davis with us today to talk about her new book, Reproductive Injustice, Racism, Pregnancy, and Premature Birth. She will be in conversation with our colleague from Columbia, Sarah Haley. And I'm going to introduce them properly in a moment. But first, I would just like to say a huge thank you to the BCRW staff and my co-director, Janet, for all their work in helping put this program together tonight. Sophie Kreetzberg, our post-bac fellow, Avi Cummings, Director of Programming and Communications, Hope Dector, Creative Director, Miriam Neptune, Senior Associate Director, Pam Phillips, the Administrative Assistant, and BCRW Research Assistants Sabrina Bone, Kristen Santarin, and Sabrina Salam. Our photographer this evening is Matt Harvey, and Jason Coker is on AV, so thank you so much. And also very big thanks to IMATS for all their help. So it is with enormous pleasure that I welcome Dána-Ain Davis to Barnard. Donna is a professor. I'm going to refer to her by her first name since I know her. It would feel weird calling her Dr. Davis, although she is very much a doctor. Donna is a professor of urban studies and anthropology and director of the Center for the Study of Women and Society at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Donna's work covers two broad domains: Black feminist ethnography and the dynamics of race and racism. And with regard to the latter, she's examined the ways race and racism animate neoliberalism and reproduction. In the last decade, Donna has focused her attention on reproduction, race, and technologies that assist in reproduction. She's written several articles addressing issues of reproduction and racism, including obstetric racism, the racial politics of pregnancy, labor, and birthing, Trump, race, and reproduction in the afterlife of slavery, feminist politics, racialized imagery, and social control, reproductive injustice in the age of Obama, with Beth Ritchie and Latosha Traylor, the Bone Collectors, and the politics of reproduction, the troubling case of Nadia Suleiman. And so you can just tell by the titles of these articles the depth and the breadth of her work. In the fall of 2021, Donna was nominated and served as the Association of Marquette University Women Chair in Humanistic Studies at Marquette. She was also the recipient of the Brosher Foundation Residency Fellowship in Switzerland. Donna's new book that we are here to celebrate has won numerous awards: the Eileen Basker Memorial Prize from the Society for Medical Anthropology, the Senior Book Prize from the Association of Feminist Anthropology. It was a finalist for the 2020 Prose Award in the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology category that's given by the Association of American Publishers. And it also received honorable mention by the Victor Turner Ethnographic Writing Award by the Committee of the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. Okay, in short, it's been a very well-received book. Donna's new book on reproductive injustice is, of course, very timely. With the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, the question of reproduction and a woman's right to choose is one of the most pressing political issues today. People are organizing to ensure that access to abortion is not cut off for people who live in states where it is now illegal, and lawsuits have been filed all over the country as well as nationally. And while this recent attack on reproductive choice is devastating and affects so many women, Donna's book reminds us that the question of reproductive justice for Black women is much more complicated and nuanced, and is not tied to a single Supreme Court decision, however important that is, but is part of a larger history of slavery and institutionalized racism in the medical industry. Reproductive Injustice is a story about Black women's access or lack of access to quality medical care that enables them to give birth to healthy babies. It's a story of the power of medical racism and obstetric racism and how it's shaping the lives of Black women. In addition to being a celebrated anthropologist and professor, Donna is deeply committed to putting into practice her philosophy of being an advocate for Black women's reproductive justice. You may not know this, but she's a practicing doula and co-founded The Art of Childbirth with doula midwife Nubia Earth Martin, offering free birth education workshops that incorporate artistic expression in Yonkers, New York. Throughout her academic career, she has participated in and helped cultivate Black feminist spaces of resistance and support. Donna and I served together as members of the editorial working group of Souls, a journal of Black culture, politics, and society, which was headed by Manning Marable and Leith Mullings. At the time, that was about 20 years ago, I think. And it was a very special place of intellectual and political engagement, an incubator of radical ideas. And Donna never failed to push us in our thinking. We also co-organized, along with Robin Spencer, 2 annual conferences for the National Women's Studies Association. And Donna, who I am convinced knows every anthropologist in the country, and maybe even outside the country, could always pull out of her hat the perfect speaker for the task at hand. So it was a real pleasure working with her. And if all of this is not enough, Donna is also a short story fiction writer. Of course, many of us might try our hand at fiction late at night in our journals that no one will ever read, but Donna is a published fiction writer, and I encourage you to check out her essay, Black Girl Triptych, in the literary journal Auburn Avenue. So we're really honored to have Donna here with us. She's going to be in conversation also with our amazing colleague, Sarah Haley, who will be in conversation with her after her talk. Professor Haley is an associate professor of gender studies and history at Columbia. Her research areas include U.S. gender history, carceral history, Black feminist and queer theory, prison abolition, and feminist archival methods. She's the author of No Mercy Here, another amazing book that if you haven't read, you should absolutely read. No Mercy Here, Gender Punishment in the Making of Jim Crow Modernity, and she is currently working on a book titled The Carceral Interior, a Feminist Study of American Punishment, 1966 to 2016. She's been active in prison abolition and labor movements, and currently organizes with Scholars for Social Justice. So just briefly about our evening tonight, Donna's going to give us a lecture for about 35 minutes. And then she and Sarah will be in conversation, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So please, warm welcome for Donna Davis.
Hi. How y'all doing? Good. I'm mostly okay. I can't see, but I'm okay. Ooh. You know, introductions are they make you feel so good. So, whoops. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I feel like I wish I was a couple of inches taller. That was just, thank you. I'm really delighted to be here this evening, and I really appreciate the invitation from BCRW to give the Helen McIntyre lecture. And I especially want to thank, in alphabetical order, Avi Cummings, Janet Jacobson, Sophie Kreitzberg, Premilla Naddison, Miriam Neptune, and the BCRW staff and those who engage in the hidden labor of cleaning and clearing before we arrive and after we leave. I'm especially excited to be in conversation with the brilliant Sarah Haley. I love your book so much. And finally, I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm honored that you took the time to be here this evening. One of the things that I thought I would do is, I'm going to be reading from the book, but before I do that, I thought I would share a slightly more personal biography. And one reason has to do with the fact that as an anthropologist, I'm very privileged to have people share their lives with me. And of late, it has increasingly felt uneven that they share and I don't necessarily. But years ago, when interviewing Black women for my first book, Battered Black Women and Welfare Reform, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, a woman asked me, who were my people and why was I so interested in domestic violence? It was not hard to respond, given that she had shared the traumatic details of her own life and domestic violence. She had told me everything about herself, and it seemed to me appropriate to answer her questions. But that was not necessarily followed by any public expression of who I am. I know that she was trying to even some unequal informational exchange and wanting to figure out if I was worthy of her trust. So I didn't hesitate to respond in kind, because although I was trained to remain distant, I understood her question to be one of developing a relationship. So in that vein, in the first step of developing a relationship with you, I will tell you that I am the daughter of John and Lafredia Davis. My father retired from AT&T at age 57 because he was sent home almost every week with stroke-level blood pressure. What was the pressure from? When I asked him, he said racism. My mother was born in the segregated South, moved to New York for high school, but returned back to Bennett College in North Carolina. She often talked about having to ride in the colored car of the train to get from school back to Harlem. It was only in the last 8 years that I learned that in the 1960s, my parents had to rely on a checker, a person who helped us secure an apartment, when we moved from Harlem to the highly segregated Riverdale section of the Bronx. Being the only Black people in the neighborhood resulted in weekly slashings of our tires. I am also the granddaughter of Frank and Angela Hall and of Albert and Corinne Davis. Both of my grandfathers died young. Both of my grandmothers were domestics. Going to work with both of them at the Beresford Apartments on Central Park West meant that I took the service elevator from the time I was 8 until my grandmother stopped working. I am the great-granddaughter of Frank Hall and Emma Jane and John Ashley of the Ashleys of the Ashley River of Charleston. Our last name serves as a distorted genealogical reminder that our family was owned by those people. I am only 2 generations away from enslavement, and it is with bitterness that I actually own the land that my great-grandfather, John Ashley, purchased from his former master in Aiken, South Carolina. When I walk on this land, I'm constantly reminded of how racism is lodged in places on which I stand. And I never visit Aiken or Augusta, Georgia, without remembering that while visiting family in the South during summers, I did in fact have to step off the sidewalk when white people walked by. So these are some of the ways in which I know racism and how its tentacles have subjected my people, broadly speaking, to labor discrimination, housing discrimination, everyday machinations of Jim Crowism acted out on our bodies. This is partly how I came to understand that racism was not a residue of history, but as a fact of it. But I also understand that racism is a point from which people organize. My grandmother did, in fact, participate in early domestic worker unions in New York City. My dad worked to help get the first group of Black people hired at AT&T in engineering jobs, and my mother was providing lunches to people on buses leaving New York to D.C. for the March on Washington. I have cousins in North Carolina and South Carolina who were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because we have a life, we are a life of people who seek to make Black freedom, and that is what inspires me. I'm inspired to uncover the ways that people understand racism, as well as the ways that we refuse it. So tonight I'm going to be reading some passages from the book, and I'll offer a little context for maybe before and after each passage. But I want to start by saying that I think reproductive injustice, racism, pregnancy, and premature birth causes some trouble. At least I hope it does. It troubles the idea that the risk of adverse birth outcomes are a result of race rather than racism. It unsettles the dominant discourse that adverse birth outcomes are a problem faced only by low-income and poor Black women, often due to the exclusion of Black women across class. And I say women because the people that I interviewed all identified as women. The book takes into account not just the fact of racism, but what racism feels like. It takes into account how Black women that I spent time with interpret racism at a complicated level of intuition infused with historical reference. Mapping some of those feelings and interpretations, I hope, allows readers to understand the blatant and subtle experiences of racism that emerge in the context of medical encounters. There are, of course, other issues that the book attempts to trouble, not the least among them the desire to produce an account of racism in reproduction that holds history and the present in ethnographic tension. My theoretical and methodological choice was to think through Saidiya Hartman's brilliant framing of the afterlife of slavery, to bring together insights from Black humanist approaches and feminist anthropology. These fields and approaches, I think, illuminate racism and reproduction across the medical system, as well as in the individual practice of medicine. The afterlife of slavery serves as a generative lens through which to analyze racism and Black women's obstetric and gynecological encounters. My work was also deeply influenced and inspired by the brilliant historian Jennifer Morgan, the brilliant Dorothy Roberts, and Leith Mullings. And as a result of all of their work, I have tried to fashion a project of reproductive racism through the lens of premature birth and neonatal intensive care units, with the understanding that reproduction is itself a racial project that goes hand in hand with the capitalist project. I would stress that a particular form of gendered racial terror working at the theoretical edges of Sarah Haley's work and the subjugation of our Black reproducing bodies happens in very particular ways that are historically constituted within and outside of the medical complex's power. That complex, like so many other complexes, exploit Black bodies, treat us as unworthy, and surveil us. At various registers, Black bodies are absent the kind of vulnerability that one might expect to be bestowed upon pregnant and birthing people. The absence of vulnerability then makes it difficult, although not impossible, to enact transformative change from within the biomedical complex. The first selection that I'm going to read comes from a chapter that explores how racism happens in the context of the neonatal intensive care unit. We assume that what takes place in the NICU are practices and activities of saving, which is not an unreasonable assumption given all of the technological acumen that space holds. The proliferation of neonatal intensive care units in the United States has changed so much about reproduction, including people's relationships to their bodies and their babies. But what I found most interesting was the way that the NICU, that space between womb and home, where medical sovereignty reigns, is a site of so much more than saving. It is a place where parental worthiness is assessed. That worthiness is very much tied to race. As one nurse shared with me, race is all up in the NICU. I had a conversation with Dr. Shane Anderson, an African-American neonatology fellow at a well-respected hospital in Louisiana. Preferring the pronoun they, Anderson was the first doctor to articulate the subtleties of how racial stereotyping and differential treatment of Black patients took place in the NICU. The subject came up when I asked Dr. Anderson whether there were differences in the way neonates were treated in the NICU based on race. Dr. Anderson shared this story of a Black mother who had given birth to twins, in which the mother was characterized as unworthy due to interpretations of her behavior. This is what he said. There was this Black mom who had twins. Let's call her Juliet. I'm just kind of speaking the way he did. Let's call her Juliet. She was around 16 or 17. She had the babies prematurely, but I don't remember at how many weeks. They had been in the NICU for 2 months. Then one of the twins went home, but the other one stayed. There was a permanent shunt in the boy's head. This is the child that stayed at the hospital. By shunt, I mean there was a little reservoir in the baby's head that had to be drained every day. The mom would come once every other week or every other week and a half, and the nurses got pissed off and said, if I were here, I'd be here every day. You know, we should get children's services involved because this is neglect. Then when Juliet would come in, the nurses were very cold to her. If she asked a question, they would say things like, if you were here, you'd know what was happening with your baby. The nurses came to us, the fellows and the neonatologists, saying, you need to get family and children's services involved. But she was 16. I just don't think she understood the gravity of the situation. And also, I think there were barriers to her being there more often. She lived an hour away, and that was a thing. It was a whole day trip. It's really complicated, but they read that as neglect, that she did not care about her babies. Dr. Anderson's recollection of Juliet served as a reminder that Black mothering has been viewed on a continuum which ranges from the ideal to the unruly. The ideal mother is a type that is fetishized and exists in perfect unity with her child. Alternatively, there is the notion of the monstrous mother, whose class and race often indict them as being dangerous for all manner of reasons. Dr. Anderson's observation illustrates that the mother is constructed by medical professionals who may perceive maternal failure if mothers don't visit their NICU-admitted child every day. So what we see is a logic of racial hierarchies that are rationality superimposed on and justify a racial ordering. In this case, racial ordering centers on Black parents who are viewed as unable to parent well, in contrast to white parents who do. This is an appraisal emboldened by perceived incompetence. In other words, NICU staff use the power of their profession and their status to code Black behavior, both differently and negatively. People shared many instances of NICU staff assembling their power as against Black patients. It included surveillance, it included harassment, it often included threatening to call Child Protective Services and/or security. So the NICU can be a place where a fiction of care is also mediated by the violence of the medical system's ability to inflict a kind of trauma. The next thing that I want to read is a selection from a chapter entitled Pregnancy and Prematurity in the Afterlife of Slavery. I'm going to share with you the story of Yvette Santana. Yvette's story pulls together several threads that led to the development of an analytical framework, obstetric racism, that came after the book was published. And we can talk about that during our conversation. In the book, one of the characteristics that became part of how obstetric racism is understood is this concept called diagnostic lapse. A diagnostic lapse results when medical professionals have too narrow or too expansive a view of a patient based on racism that leads to a misdiagnosis. In many cases, it is assumptive. One of the most, I think, cogent examples of diagnostic lapses outside of my own work is positioned by I think she's a brilliant anthropologist, Chelsea Carter, who just finished her PhD and is at Yale. And she notes the way racism operates in the case of Lou Gehrig's disease, such that often when a Black person presents with symptoms of Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, it is often assumed that they're drug addicted. That is an example of a diagnostic lapse. And in the narrative that I'm about to read to you, a diagnostic lapse, actually a series of them, occurred during several instances of Yvette Santana's pregnancy, during her experience in the emergency room, and after her twins were born. Late one Sunday night, as Yvette Santana drove 2 hours to go home from a meeting, we spoke. She had me on speakerphone, and during that time, she chronicled her pregnancy and the birth of her twins. In her late 40s when we spoke, Yvette is an administrator in higher education who waited to have children until she was 40. Yvette and her husband at the time, Carlos, were in a commuter relationship. He lived in Washington, D.C., and she in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they shuttled between the two cities. When Yvette and Carlos decided to have children, her physician told Yvette that her fibroids would complicate conception. To facilitate becoming pregnant, Yvette endured 2 myomectomies. After the surgeries, which left her uterus compromised, she underwent in vitro fertilization. Although Yvette's age and her use of assisted reproductive technology should have signaled potential issues, she believed that her OBGYN, who specialized in high-risk pregnancies, viewed her pregnancy with too little concern. Yvette attributes his indifference to a comment she says he made, that Yvette did not have the markers of being Black. She did not have high blood pressure, nor did she have diabetes. But those are also indicators of a high-risk pregnancy. In fact, according to Yvette, her doctor accused her of being a hypochondriac, and asked if she was trying to make herself high risk. Her response was, "I'm almost 40. I'm pregnant with twins. Yeah, that makes me high risk. I have a very high possibility of delivering early." So due to what she perceived as the physician's lack of concern, Yvette searched for and found another doctor in Washington, D.C., a Black woman from whom she received affirmation about the potential seriousness of her pregnancy. Speaking by phone, this doctor agreed that Yvette sounded as if her pregnancy might be met with problems and offered to provide care during her pregnancy if Yvette wanted. But she would need her records. Just before a trip to Washington, Yvette visited her OBGYN in Charlotte for 2 reasons. She didn't feel well, and she wondered if she were well enough to fly. Yvette planned to spend some time with her husband and to set up an appointment with the potential doctor. He said, "Yeah, go for it. You're fine. There's no problem." But when she got on the plane, Yvette said she did not feel right. I called the doctor in D.C., and she told me, "Go back to your doctor." But we were on the tarmac, so I stayed on the plane and I flew to D.C. Upon landing in Washington, D.C., Yvette said she felt like crap. She went to a hospital emergency room close to the airport, but the doctor with whom she had previously spoken, the woman, was not affiliated with that hospital, so Yvette never saw her. While in the ER, Yvette completed paperwork, but she says no one really attended to her. And although she indicated that she felt ill and that she actually might be in labor, instead of addressing that possibility, ER personnel ignored her. "I was not manifesting enough symptoms of distress for them to be concerned," she said. Yet, Yvette said that she was continually asked if she were on drugs. The only medical attention Yvette reported that she received involved being tested 2 times to determine if she were on methamphetamines. Several hours after arriving at the hospital, her twins were born at 26 weeks. Yvette had given birth prematurely to a girl who was 1 pound 8 ounces and a boy who was 2 pounds 1 ounce. Both were admitted to the NICU. During their stay in the NICU, nurses insisted that her twins would survive, although they were small. They kept telling me, "Oh, you know, Black babies make it all the time. There's nothing to worry about. They're so fit." Over 28 days, Yvette spent most of her time at the hospital with her children. One day, she decided to go home, take a shower, and return later to spend the evening with the babies. Within an hour of leaving the hospital, Yvette received a phone call asking her to return. When she arrived, she found out that her son had passed away, having succumbed to MRSA, the hospital-based staph infection. The nurses, she said, were shocked at his death, probably given their prediction that Black babies are so strong and fit. Yvette concluded that the nurses' belief in strong Black babies worked against her son. And then she confessed that if they had seen her children as fragile, not strong, maybe they would have taken better care of her son. Maybe they would have been more careful, and she would have taken home both twins instead of one. At the end of our conversation, Yvette said, "If I had been white with blonde hair, I bet my son would be alive." So there are several lapses that were perpetrated by Yvette's doctor in Charlotte, who miscalculated that the absence of what he believed as a racial illness, high blood pressure, and diabetes, caused him to basically engage in a willful inattention to medically manage her pregnancy in a way that she thought appropriate, and that she felt exemplified racism. Because she did not display illnesses associated with being Black, he neglected to attend to the danger that her pregnancy did pose, which was actually replete with risks. She was 40, she'd had fibroids, she'd had IVF, and she was pregnant with twins. At the ER, the diagnostic lapse lay in the fact that ER personnel actually didn't think she was telling the truth about being in labor. She wasn't yelling or screaming, and during our conversation, she'd also said, I wasn't acting like a loud Black woman. So instead, they misdiagnosed her as being a drug addict. And then finally, we see diagnostic lapse in the way that Yvette interpreted her children being treated. There are several racist beliefs that exist about survival, and that one became a fictive diagnostic feature that Yvette believed influenced her son's death. Because often what circulates in the NICU are the ways that are interesting ways in which racism creeps into care in quotes, including the strong Black baby, which is often contrasted with what is called the wimpy white boy syndrome. The last selection that I'm going to read comes from the chapter that addresses radical care. There's never been a time when Black women's reproduction was treated respectfully in the United States. Racist ideology and racist practices have permeated the content of Black women's reproductive lives. Black women have been mistreated, misdiagnosed, derided, pushed aside, and erased. And in this last section, I'm going to share a version of a story that appears in the book because I wanted to give you some more information. It's about Crystal Rainey and her birth story and her choice to have a doula during her pregnancy. So Crystal Rainey is 28 years old. She was married, and she was excited to share her birth story with me, which centered on her having a doula. She was very animated when we were together. Prior to being a stay-at-home mom with her son, Junior, who was born in 2016, Crystal Rainey was an hourly wage employee at a social services agency that serviced autistic children, where she said she was putting her psychology degree to good use. After chatting for a while, I asked Crystal to tell me her birth story. Crystal began her story by saying she was well aware that when people meet her, they think they have met a teenager. She looked so young, she was like 18. And the relevance of this remark became very clear later in our conversation, and you'll find out what happened. I asked Crystal to describe the factors that influenced how she wanted to give birth, and in response, she told me that she had done research on birthing practices and decided that she wanted a natural childbirth with a doula. Why? I asked. She said, since Black people are subjected to high degrees of policing, she feared that she might lose her child or her husband to violence, and she wanted a peaceful birth. Also, Crystal had heard and read about Black women's negative experiences with the medical system, and this too contributed to her desire to explore other birthing options. Crystal was determined to have a peaceful birth, a birth designed to symbolize the kind of relationship she'd hoped to have with her child. In other words, articulating her desires about the labor and birthing, those were intended to compensate for what she viewed as a future disruption of her family through violence. Initially, Crystal wanted a home birth. However, her husband was nervous about that, and they settled on having a doula and a delivery at a birth center. With her doula, Adjoa, Crystal created a birth plan. She did not want Pitocin, which enhances contractions, and she did not want a C-section. Crystal wanted immediate skin-to-skin contact after the baby's birth, and she wanted to breastfeed on demand, which most professionals suggest begins within 4 hours after giving birth. Crystal went into labor at 40 weeks. She called Adjoa, who said that she would meet Crystal and her husband at the birth center. After being at the birth center for many hours, staff transferred Crystal to the emergency room of a local public hospital. Adjoa's arrival at the birth center crossed Crystal's departure, and so she didn't get to see Crystal until a little bit later. The reason for Crystal's transfer was, according to the birth center, Crystal had meconium-stained fluid, meaning that there was fecal matter in the amniotic fluid. And center staff, birth center staff, were worried about the baby having a meconium aspiration, which is when a newborn inhales their first stool, which can lead to serious illness. Upon her arrival at the emergency room of a public hospital near the birthing center, which is also a trauma center, she spent a whole day waiting for a room assignment. During that time, she said the ER was chaotic. It looked like an apocalypse. There were people with gunshot wounds, there was blood everywhere, and so 24 hours after her labor had begun, moving into the second day, Crystal was finally assigned to a room. In the room, Crystal met a Black female obstetrician who was supposed to attend to her birth, who Crystal described to me as being nasty. When I asked her why she thought the doctor was nasty, Crystal said, "I told the doctor I had a birth plan and that my doula would be arriving shortly." In response, the obstetrician, according to Crystal, sneered, "It will not be honored." Crystal mimicked the OB's tone, the obstetrician's tone, which was inflected with condescension. And then she said that the OB badgered her to sign a release form consenting to the C-section. After all, she had been in labor for a day and a half. Some of the interaction with the doctor took place before Adjoa arrived, so there was actually no mediator to explain to Crystal the threat of meconium aspiration and how serious it was, and therefore, her plan for a natural childbirth might not be in the baby's best interest. The doctor's dismissiveness, though, and the fact that she was condescending really galled Crystal, because really what Crystal wanted and needed was to have things explained to her, rather than being pressured to sign release forms without the knowledge of what was happening and why. Crystal's interpretation of why the doctor pressured her and was dismissive and nasty was because she looked young, and the doctor assumed that her husband was, and she said, the baby's daddy, as if that's not a legitimate role. And only a husband, wife, and child triad constituted a real family. This is where her youth became part of that initial assessment in telling her birth story. With no one to explain to her that meconium aspiration can result in fetal distress and lead to an emergency C-section, Crystal remained uninformed of the consequences. She pushed back and kept insisting that they stick with the birth plan. Then Crystal devised a strategy. She overheard the doctor comment that she was going off duty shortly. So then Crystal refused to sign the paperwork, saying that she needed to think about the C-section. Her refusal was really a delay tactic, that resulted in Crystal having a different OB on shift assigned to her. According to Crystal, this second doctor was much nicer, and along with Adjua, who had arrived, explained all that was going on. Only then, after Crystal felt comfortable with the new obstetrician, did she sign the consent form for the C-section. She in fact received Pitocin, an epidural, had a C-section. So everything she did not want to happen, happened. Junior, named after his father, arrived, and Crystal only saw him briefly, just before staff whisked him off to the neonatal intensive care unit. Crystal, her husband, and Adjua were told that Junior had to be admitted to the NICU for observation because, they said, meconium was present in the amniotic fluid. On the first day after his birth, in her wheelchair, Crystal made it to the NICU, which was on a different floor than her recovery. She inquired why her son was in the NICU, and a resident dismissively told Crystal, "Because we have to monitor him." She asked to breastfeed him, but then was told to return. She was not given a breast pump, so Adjua demanded one. It's okay. This is hard. The day after Junior's birth, Crystal went again to breastfeed him, struggling to walk to get to the NICU through the NICU. Through a barely audible voice, she said, "It was like Junior was in jail. The NICU was far from where I was. I had just had a C-section, and I had to walk to a different floor to see him. The doors were really heavy, and it was really hard because I didn't have any abdominal muscles. I also wanted to breastfeed on demand. I would go up there, but then they would send me away and tell me to come back, but it was so hard to move." One day, Crystal asked a different resident why Junior was in the NICU. The resident said he was unsure, but would check Junior's file, which had included a lung scan. Shortly after reviewing Junior's records, the resident told Crystal that Junior's lungs looked typical for a healthy baby. She said, "So if he looks like a typical newborn, why is he still here?" Crystal also asked the NICU personnel why Junior was on IV, receiving fluids. A NICU staff member said that Junior was not receiving enough fluids from her breastfeeding when they allowed her to do so. She said to me, "Thank God I attended all those childbirth classes, because I said to them, can't you measure if he's getting enough liquids through his diaper? I mean, if he's peeing, we know he's getting enough liquids." According to Crystal, after that comment, the medical staff said, "Oh, you're right." Crystal later discovered that Junior had not inhaled meconium. Indeed, meconium staining happens in 6 to 25% of the cases, but only 11% of the time does it result in meconium aspiration. Yet Junior was kept in the NICU for 5 days. Crystal told me that she believed this was done as a form of punishment for making demands about her birth plan. Crystal felt that the doctors viewed her as just another young black girl who could be ignored, and they kept her son in the neonatal intensive care unit because she had insisted in having some say about her birth. "Maybe I'm wrong," she said, but both her husband and Adjua shared her suspicion. Crystal told me that she became depressed after she was released from the hospital because she was made to feel that she was inconveniencing them, even wrong for having asked for what she wanted and being an engaged patient. Although telling her story was stressful, and there were times at which she spoke in an inaudible voice, she only cried once. And that was when, for reasons that were unclear to her, she told me that her discharge papers indicated that she had been admitted to the hospital for many reasons, but one of which was being uncooperative. So she sent me a copy of her discharge papers after we met. Crystal said she was stunned because Junior was in the hospital for 5 days, and she and her husband went there every single day to see him. She was involved in his care and was very present. Yet it was NICU staff who would not allow her to feed Junior on demand, but would make her return later. But she didn't want to fight them. She acquiesced to the doctors and nurses, mostly because she didn't want to be labeled a bad mom. Crystal feared that if she was labeled a bad mom for making too many demands, for asking too many questions, they would take her child away from her. But none of her fight to have the birth that she wanted, but did not have, to breastfeed her son, to make inquiries about why her son was in the NICU, was done alone. She was supported by Adjua and her husband, and Crystal said, "I wasn't fighting by myself. My doula was there to make sure I was okay." There's a lot to think through with Crystal's experience, but I do want to focus on what she thought of as the important role that doulas play. Contrary to public policy belief, she was clear that her doula was not going to eliminate racism. She understood, that's a problem of our former governor. She understood the role of the doula as one whose labor was to support her struggles, if any arose, and her joys. The doula was to serve as a witness, a companion, a mediator, and a translator. And doulas and other reproductive justice advocates possess the possibilities of disrupting the violence of care perpetrated on people because many of us, not all, understand the history of Black reproduction and seek to create connections not only with individuals that we are providing support to, but alongside those who are part of broader movements that organize really against the history of eugenics. Because one might argue that the kind of care that Black people don't get is part of a eugenic project or has a eugenic history. Individually, doulas cannot make a problematic institution like the medical system revise or eliminate racist practices or procedures. What we do it in collaboration and collectively with other doulas, reproductive justice advocates, midwives, social justice workers, food justice workers. And we do that because we do want to transform a system. Some people want to work from within, but a lot of people want to work outside. Crystal wanted a doula because she understood that she herself had to strategize in the best interest of her own possibility and knew that the possibility of a better birthing experience, or at least one that validated her reality, did in fact depend on the presence of another person. So this book unpacks the meaning that Black women give to their medical encounters. And in sharing Black women's narratives, I think we learn an affective story of racism. It's what it feels like. Not that it's socially constructed, which most people tend to agree upon, but what it feels like. When most people think of Black women's adverse birth outcomes, they assume that those outcomes are the result of low income or impoverishment, or people's bad behavior, or unwillingness to follow direct orders from their medical providers. But I'm hoping that the book reveals that people across the class spectrum, across the educational spectrum, have similar kinds of birth outcomes, adverse birth outcomes, and similar kinds of medical encounters. So in writing the book, I wanted people to unlearn several things. I wanted people to unlearn the way that society has pigeonholed poor and low-income people as being responsible for their own health and birth outcomes. I wanted people to unlearn that Black people who do in fact have various degrees of capital, that they do not experience. I want them to unlearn this idea that people don't experience racism, because there is definitely a malleable rule of exemption. I wanted people to unlearn the fact that we do place the medical complex on a pedestal such that we think pregnancy must be medicalized at the expense of having a more expansive view of pregnancy and birthing options. And when I say that, I'm not suggesting that there is no place for medicine, but I am saying that we most certainly need to have access to more birthing options, including home births, including birthing centers, including having people possibly go to a hospital if they want, but have a team of people that they want to be there. And assuming that there are no complications, I would also argue that there, and not just me, lots of us, would argue that there needs to be the same reimbursement rate for a midwife-attended home birth as a hospital birth. I hope that medical providers learn that the clinical expertise that they have must be mediated by the expertise that people have about their own bodies. And even if a person is not right about their self-diagnosis, that does not mean that they are absolutely wrong. I hope that the book and the work that has emerged out of it allows activists to push for radical caring on the part of the medical community, although that is an oxymoron. That people do want to, people want to be treated with integrity and intelligent, as if they're intelligent and with compassion. And the thing is that we can actually use Black women's experiences to calculate the likelihood that something, in fact, will happen, and accept that from their point of view, an event was racist. And it's our job, I think, to respect that perspective. Why? Because Black women's bodies may be viewed as archives of many experiences, racism being one. Our bodies have historically been experimented upon, deployed for capitalist purposes, used as fodder for political machinations that harm us. From the front of us to the back of us, from each side of us, Black bodies are a restless archive of things done to them with little to no regard for the trail of consequences left behind. Experiments to correct vesico-vaginal fistulas, the overutilization of C-sections, which occurs at a higher rate for Black women than women of any other racial or ethnic group, the unwillingness to allow for vaginal births after a C-section, for forced reproduction, histories of compulsory sterilization, sterilizations without consent, Black women viewed as being a high promiscuity risk, resulting in terminations, or testing Depo-Provera without knowledge of potential risks. And I don't know if people saw this, but there was an article on Monday about a drug called McIntyre, which is a drug that's supposed to disrupt the tendency of a person who's already had a premature birth from them having another one. And the FDA accelerated the approval of that drug, which it was later determined that it's not particularly effective. And so the FDA wants the drug pulled off the market. So the pharmaceutical then sold the drug to a company in Luxembourg, which then decided to conduct focus groups with Black women to get them to say that it was successful. So all of these are the ways that racism's lessons are etched on Black bodies. They are the lessons of disregard. They are the lessons that perpetuate the belief that Black bodies feel pain differently, that Black women who make demands are uncooperative or angry, that Black women are viewed outside the bounds of normativity, and that non-normativity comes from Black women being too large, too single, too Black, too deviant, too risky, too excessive, too fertile, too queer. We are viewed on a continuum of extremes, which leaves us legible to also being viewed as extraordinary, but extraordinary in very harmful ways. We're strong like Yvette, but then when we assert ourselves like Crystal, we're uncooperative. Being on a continuum of extremes leaves Black women vulnerable to excessive neglect and excessive intervention. We are overdetermined as subjects, and our mediated bodies have become the target of ideas from the past that have migrated the way that we are dealt with in the present. And we deserve so much more. Thank you.
Hi. I have the unfortunate responsibility of following that talk with a conversation with relevant questions, but I just wanted to say how powerful this book is and that talk was, and hearing it out loud. And it's daunting to be in conversation with you as someone who whose work is in Black feminism, and your work has been so influential. And so it's really an honor to talk to you tonight. and to be here. So I feel compelled by the ending of your talk to begin with a question about storytelling. You know, you presented us with Yvette's story and Crystal's story, and it strikes me from both reading and hearing you read from the book that this is in deep conversation with theorists like Catherine McKittrick, who in her recent book, Dear Science, talked about storying as theory. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you approach the story, how you approach hearing and recounting and narrating and making choices about that. I'm particularly struck because McKittrick talks about the story as contesting kind of biocentric accounts and as a way of practicing Black livingness. And this work is about Black livingness in doubt, right? Like always under peril, always in doubt. So, yeah.
Thank you. So to be in a sort of intellectual, in an intellectual space with Catherine McKittrick is an honor. Thank you for that. One of the things that I would say about her work is in her book, Dear Science, she uses the term methodological disobedience. But then in a talk that she gave with you and Ruthie Gilmore and a few others, I think I heard her say disciplinary disobedience. And that was not language that I had when I was writing. But I do think that Black livingness comes really profoundly from storytelling. I mean, that's, I think a lot of anthropologists, most of us are storytellers. But of course, we have this, as an anthropologist, that's how I'm going to talk about this, we have this history of both storytelling and creative storytelling, right? In Black studies, really, broadly. I'm thinking of the brilliant way, I don't know what people's feelings are about Du Bois, but the brilliant way that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote and produced The Star of Ethiopia, a pageant that was performed in 1913, 15, 16, and 25, with hundreds and hundreds of people to tell a story of Black life over centuries. We have storytellers and beautiful narratives in various forms by Zora Neale Hurston. We have storytelling and embodied performances by Katherine Dunham. So we have a history in our discipline of storytelling in really creative ways about Black livingness, about Black futurity, about possibility, right? But I will say that I think, well, wait a minute. And then we have more contemporary people doing creating beautiful narratives. I think Amy Cox is one of them. Savannah Shange is another. And what I like about the way Catherine McKittrick lays out Black livingness through creative storytelling is she also talks about citation, right? And we've got, in our discipline, we have John Jackson, who tells a whole other narrative in his footnotes. I mean, you're basically reading two books, right? And I would say that the storytelling that I do, I think, comes from the family that I'm in, which was all about stories. but was deeply supported by my mentor. I don't like to use the word mentor, I just said that the other day, by my friend, Leith Mullings. And she supported not only storytelling of Black livingness, but she supported her students in being really creative about the ways in which we collected data. And do you mind if I just share a little bit about what that was like? Okay. So I don't remember, back in the 90s, right after welfare reform had been passed by that president. I'm not naming his name. Leith was approached to develop a program called the Scholar Practitioner Program, and I was a beneficiary of that, along with 6 other people. So we were 7 women of color who were collecting data to examine the impact of welfare reform policy in 2 communities in New York City, Harlem and the Lower East Side, Chinatown, in fact. And Leith had us develop our own strategies to do this. So we did typical things like focus groups and did surveys, but we also implemented what was then a fairly new methodological approach, which was photo voice, very much used in public health. And we're giving cameras to people in Harlem and on the Lower East Side to take pictures of what the impact of welfare reform has been. Then we bring people together and have them talk about what those images mean. And then collectively they develop captions. And then we take all of these images and organize them in the form of an exhibit. And we do exhibits in Harlem and Lower East Side. The exhibit went to some meeting of the Congressional Black Caucus. And we heard people talking about their lives. So we decided that we're gonna, they were very deeply stressed about the loss of health care. So we interview people and take pictures and create these one-page sheets that they, the people, could use when they went to Albany to basically protest about the outcomes of welfare policy. Now, so this is a 3-year project, and we're not the only team doing this. We're in New York. There's a team in Florida, Mississippi, the state of Washington, Wisconsin, and I'm missing a state. We're working with communities, we're working with community-based organizations. And I don't remember any of this until last Thursday when I had to write comments honoring her. And I'm struck, and I'm thinking, what is this method that she brought us? We never had a conversation about methods. We had never had a conversation about stories. And in one brief moment, I was like, oh my God, what she supported us in doing was the manifestation of a Black radical tradition. Mm-hmm. The possibilities of working with community so that they could develop their own strategies for addressing the ways in which they were being oppressed through workfare in particular. And then we did all of these other interesting things, which was take the kind of information that people said they needed in order to successfully move through the new welfare system. And we did these palm cards. I'm remembering this all like last Thursday night. And we did these palm cards in English, Spanish, and Mandarin so that people would be able to identify quickly the way that they could get resources in New York City. So, all of that to say that the support of methodological disobedience in order to honor Black livingness comes from many sources,
But it's really stunning when it comes from a person who you're like in class with, you know, who never used the term Marxist, but had an idea that we were all supporting a revolution.
That was so powerful, and it's so interesting that you raised that particular memory of Professor Mullings, because when I was at UCLA, I was in gender studies and African American studies, and so I happened to have graduate students from a bunch of fields, including sociology. And a sociologist found me named Susila Gurusamy, and she said, I want to work with this method. I'm just learning about it, called photo voice. And it was in her work on formerly incarcerated women and sharing their experiences with the carceral state. So it's just, I'm so struck by the kind of methodological disobedience and creativity as a confrontation with violence, whether it be economic, whether it be domestic, whether it be reproductive, right? And so that's not really a question, but I'm just really, you know, it is in struggle, right? That these methods are formed.
And it's what you do, what you did in your book,
well,
but she does.
Okay, we're moving along because I do have a question. That was just a preamble, a long preamble to the question that is related, which is about your theory of obstetric racism, which you developed from an article that comes after the book. And I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about the afterlife of obstetric racism as a theory, because it's really a model for how Black feminist scholarship can be mobilized for change.
Yeah, obstetric racism. So one thing I want to say about obstetric racism, obstetric racism is the historically constituted ways in which the medical complex perpetuates practices, policies, and procedures against Black bodies because they are Black bodies. And it's a term that sits at the intersection of medical racism and obstetric violence. Obstetric violence emerging in Latin America, in particular Venezuela, rooted in a human rights framework. But of course, well, Venezuela also has a human rights approach, which we don't. And what I was trying to get at, because people kept saying to me, oh, you know, I really think you're talking about obstetric violence. And I was like, no. Yeah, but you are. No. So what I was trying to get at were the very particular ways that being Black in the United States has its own history of racism, and there are lots of other histories, salud, of racism. But in the US, there's a particular historical set of processes that we can explore. And I was very interested in making sure that obstetric racism could be named as opposed to unconscious bias, which holds no one accountable, doesn't explain anything, just sits out there and allows hospitals and are there any medical people in here? I can't see you. I have to put on a different set of glasses. Hi. But it's true. So I don't like unconscious bias, because A, I think it's not true. And I don't believe that people can be in medicine, in that field, a part of that system, without any knowledge of the history of how medicine was developed in the United States. So, that said, obstetric racism was both, an analytic and
Occurrence.
An occurrence, yes, an analytic and an occurrence. And I identified several dimensions that emerged out of the patterned experiences that I saw from these women's stories. They were diagnostic lapses, which I've talked about. They were degradation, ceremonies of degradation, intentionally causing pain, neglect, and dismissiveness. That was one category. Medical abuse. And there's one more that I'm just failing to remember. Sorry. But those dimensions, and they're not neatly discrete. One event can occur in multiple spaces. So that's what it was. All right. That's how, it gets developed. I go to Spain, I go to France, I talk about obstetric racism, and like, are you sure? We don't have racism in France. I'm like, oh, really? Are you sure it's not obstetric violence? Yeah. Do you think this applies to women in like Latin and South American countries? I was like, I don't know, you should do that research. I did not. And what about, indigenous women? I said, there's a whole framework that somebody could explore. Like, I don't have to do all the work for all the things, because I know that basically what you're trying to do is hamstring me. So apparently there are debates about this. So next week I'm giving a talk at a conference that's being held in Barcelona, where I'm invited to give a keynote on obstetric racism, but the panel is obstetric violence. I know they're just trying to mess with me, but it's okay. I got it for them. Okay, so what's happened with obstetric racism? This woman, Karen Scott, who is an OBGYN epidemiologist, she calls herself a recovering OBGYN epidemiologist. She takes obstetric racism, holds a series of focus groups, mostly in California, and sees similar kinds of narratives with Black women, and sees similar kinds of narratives and expressions about how people experience racism in medical settings. And then she develops a survey, there's a number that needs to be reached, survey respondents, in order for it to be valid. That number is 819, I think. Then we get back all the responses, and then we develop a PREM, a patient-reported experience measure of obstetric racism, which is the only patient-reported experience measure that has been theorized by a Black woman, designed by a Black OBGYN, rooted in Black women's experiences, to tell hospitals, this is what racism feels like. So and then it gets validated. And then people are like, are you sure it's racism? So, we do trainings, and she creates a whole suite of activities so that hospitals around the country can implement obstetric race, the PREM-OB scale. And then the hospitals start freaking out. Because they really like, there's a commitment to unconscious bias. So, but we train the state of North Carolina, all 6 regions, on what obstetric racism is. So Karen says at the first meeting, we're not going to have a conversation about whether or not racism is real and whether or not what a person says is racism. So then they don't have anything to talk about. But the PREM-OB is an interesting measure that I think could have a lot of utility. Some hospital systems are interested in it. Some of them don't really want to hear about racism because they don't really know what to do about it. But then as we're moving through, we're learning, we talk a lot about doctors. Doctors are low-hanging fruit. The real issue in a hospitalist setting around racism has to do with quality improvement and quality implementation. Those are the people who are really focused on the degree to which a hospital is going to be sued. They're interested in reducing litigiousness. So then she develops a series of events for that. The final thing, so that's one thing that's happened with obstetric racism. It's circulating in the world. People are using it. I read somewhere that it was the concept or the framework or something was translated into Portuguese. So now there's, obstetric racism shows up with people who are, among people who are doing work in Brazil. But the other thing that we did, well, we didn't do it, a lawyer did it. We wrote a memo to the Office of Civil Rights that will allow instances of obstetric racism and obstetric violence to be used by people who wanted to file a suit, a civil rights suit. They've rejected all of them so far. There's only been 2. But it doesn't matter, I guess part of the goal is to keep submitting. So that's where we are with obstetric racism.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it feels a little dystopic.
Yeah.
It's not, I had no sense that this would happen.
But that kind of, whatever we think about the legal apparatus, right, that kind of possibility of validation or of expression for people who have experienced it is enormous, right?
It is.
I think we are.
We are almost out of time. We have 5 minutes left, and I do want to give anybody in the audience who has a pressing question, maybe we can take a couple questions or comments if you have them.
Hi, so I work with young people, mostly middle school and high school kids, so I'm wondering what can I do to kind of get young people's mind prepared for some of the things that you're talking about, because I think it would be good to have young people start to be aware of these type of things.
Thank you. That's such a great question. And it's really amazing the things that we can talk about with young people and the things that we can't talk about with young people, like sexuality and just sex and like condoms, important stuff. And I don't think that we talk about history enough with them. I'm not a historian, but I'm a wannabe. But I do think that there's a place for, there's a place for narratives and stories, and a lot of it I think can come in the form of films. I don't know how old the young people are, but I think people should watch the film Aftershock that was done by Tanya Lee, which has my co-leader in childbirth education in it. But we do need to create safe spaces, right? And we do need to have sex and sexuality education. And I'm amazed at how much young people don't know about birth and babies or anything. So I think there are lots of opportunities. I don't know if I'm not a curriculum developer, but that's my intuitive sense.
Well, I just like to talk to young people about things that are happening in the world that, that sometimes you don't realize until you actually grown and in the world, you know what I mean? So.
And I think there are so many, so I did major in film once upon a time, and I love using film to get people to, to generate conversation. I think it's really, really effective because you, as the, session leader, get protected, there's a protective mechanism, and then there are pieces that can be opened up and conversations that can happen. And it's really amazing, I think, what young people see when they can look at film. So that's what I would do. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a really important question, right? Because it's part of the process of how we empower people, to advocate for themselves. I am really sorry to say we have run out of time, but wow, what an incredible evening, and I cannot tell you how wonderful this has been. Huge round of applause. Thank you, Donna.